Christmas morning, 1895. Snow sits on the Blue Ridge Mountains like a secret no one's allowed to speak out loud. The air bites, wood smoke, pine resin, cold iron. Outside Asheville, a private road climbs through forests that feel endless. Then come the gates. Heavy. Certain. And beyond them, something that doesn't fit inside the word home. Biltmore rises from the hillside like an imported myth. Limestone walls. Slate roofs pitched steep enough to shed winter itself. Towers and turrets catching pale light. 4 acres under one roof, so large it stops being a residence and starts behaving like a kingdom. 35 bedrooms. 65 fireplaces. A banquet hall that stretches upward like a cathedral. A library packed with roughly 10,000 volumes. The numbers sound impressive, but they don't explain the feeling. The building doesn't welcome you, it judges you. Step into the entrance hall and look up. Stone lifts for 3 stories, designed to make your body understand its place. Carved oak clings to the edges. Marble shines underfoot. Stained glass filters the thin winter daylight into colors that feel too rich for the season. This isn't decoration, it's a message you've entered something built to overwhelm. But the real story begins when you stop staring at the showpiece rooms. Because the beauty has a backside. Behind the library, beyond the winter garden's glass roof and fountain, past the banquet hall's giant fireplace, there's another world, quiet, narrow, functional. A second circulation system hidden inside the palace. Service corridors painted dull and practical. Tight staircases meant for fast steps and lowered eyes. Doors that don't announce themselves. Routes designed so the wealthy never have to see the effort that makes luxury look effortless. Down below, the basement isn't romantic, it's industrial. Boilers the size of small factory machines burn coal to force heat through miles of pipes. Storerooms keep linens, china, crystal, and silver stacked like inventory. Kitchens run like a production line, not a family room. Everything has a place because everything must work. This house doesn't run on vibes, it runs on labor, fuel, and constant attention. More than 100 workers keep Biltmore alive. Maids, cooks, footmen, laundresses, stable hands, gardeners, foresters, drivers, engineers who watch wiring and generators like hawks, plumbers who fight the pipes, still unusual in rural places at the time. Remove one roll and the machine starts to stutter. Remove too many and the dream collapses, and the cost is relentless. Coal arrives by the ton. Repairs never stop. A roof slate shifts, plaster cracks. Pipes strain when winter tightens its grip. The heating plant demands daily checks. The house eats resources the way a storm eats a landscape, quietly at first, then all at once. That Christmas, though, none of it shows. Garlands and candles dress the public rooms. Music moves through the winter garden. Guests arrive by train, then by carriage, climbing that long approach as if they're being drawn into a story. After dark, electric light turns the mansion into a beacon against the mountains, modern magic inside medieval stone. For a few glittering days, the dream feels complete. But under the celebration, the pressure is already there, like ice forming beneath the surface of a lake. Because Biltmore is magnificent, and it is also a machine built to consume. And by the end of that first Christmas, one silent question is already sharpening in the shadows: how long can this last? To understand why Biltmore exists at all, you have to understand the kind of man who imagined it. Because the builder wasn't a loud titan strutting through society. He wasn't chasing applause. He wasn't trying to win the Newport Arms race of bigger ballrooms and brighter chandeliers. George Washington Vanderbilt Tepru was born in 1862 into the richest American dynasty of the age. The Vanderbilt name didn't just mean money, it meant systems. Steamships. Railroads. Networks that moved the country like blood through arteries. His grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, had built a fortune so enormous it rewired what wealth could look like in America. By the time George received his share, the family wasn't merely affluent, it was symbolic. A surname that functioned like a crown. But George didn't act like a crowned man. Where his siblings built glittering palaces and lived at the center of society's spotlight, George slipped away from it. He was known as shy, soft-spoken, and uncomfortable in crowds. Instead of collecting famous guests, he collected ideas. Books, art, languages. He moved through life like someone who was always listening more than he was speaking, always observing, always measuring, always building an inner world strong enough to stand without applause. He traveled often, especially to Europe. But not the way socialites traveled. He wasn't hunting parties. He was hunting structure, how old estates were planned, how gardens and forests and buildings worked together as one organism. He studied obtuse libraries, farms, and managed woodlands like they were living textbooks. While other wealthy Americans treated land as scenery, George treated land as a system, something you could shape, restore, and run with discipline. And he wanted a place of his own, not a seasonal showpiece to impress strangers for a few weeks each summer. Not a ballroom designed for gossip and champagne. He wanted something quieter, more private, and almost stubbornly purposeful. A retreat where he could read, think, collect art, manage forests scientifically, and live far from the noise of northern society. So the question became, where do you build a private kingdom that feels like it belongs to you, not to the world watching you? In 1888, George visited Asheville, North Carolina, with his mother. At the time, Asheville was becoming a magnet for wealthy Northerners escaping summer heat. The mountains promised cool air and clean lungs. The scenery was dramatic, Blue Ridge ridgelines rolling into one another like waves. And crucially, the Southern Railway had extended service to the area, making it reachable without turning it into a crowded resort. George arrived and felt something click. Not just admiration, something closer to recognition. The landscape felt like an answer. Remote enough to be private, beautiful enough to feel like Europe, and vast enough to support the kind of estate he had in his head. He began buying land. At first, it was just parcels, then more parcels, then farms and hillsides and worn-out fields that other people had abandoned. Some had been logged hard, stripped of their best trees. Others had been farmed until the soil gave up. The land wasn't pristine. It was scarred. But George didn't see only damage. He saw potential, a wounded landscape that could be restored if someone had enough patience, enough money, and enough will to treat nature like something worth repairing. Over time, his holdings ballooned into something almost absurd, more than 125,000 acres, nearly 200 square miles, a footprint larger than many European principalities. When people hear mansion, they picture a house. George was building something closer to a domain. And in his mind, the house was not the whole story. It would be the centerpiece, yes, but it would sit inside a functioning estate farm supplying food, forests managed to produce timber without destroying the land, and a carefully designed landscape meant to feel inevitable, like it had always been there. The plan was ambitious. It was also expensive in a way most people couldn't even measure. George believed he could do it because Vanderbilt wealth wasn't just piles of cash, it was capital that generated income. Investments that paid dividends. In the late 1880s and early 1890s, it still seemed possible to believe that fortune could carry both construction and long-term operating costs. In that moment, America's richest families lived like their money would last forever. But Biltmore wasn't a normal rich person project. It wasn't a summer cottage with nice furniture. It wasn't a city townhouse. It was 4 acres under one roof, filled with technology that was cutting edge for the time. Electric light, elevators, central heating powered by massive boilers, refrigeration, fire alarms, call buttons embedded into the woodwork. This wasn't just architecture, it was infrastructure disguised as art. Even the first estimates hinted at the scale. The rough, early budget for the house alone was often cited around $5 million, an amount that, translated into modern buying power, becomes the kind of figure that makes people blink. And that was before you count the land purchases, the rail spur, The farms, the forestry program, the staff payroll, the repairs, the fuel, the constant maintenance that a stone giant demands every day it stays alive. George didn't see those numbers as a warning. He saw them as the admission price for building something meant to last. But he also knew he couldn't do it alone. A dream this large needed masters, people who knew how to turn ambition into stone, wood, roads, water, and systems. So George went looking for two men who could translate vision into reality. The first was Richard Morris Hunt, the most celebrated architect of America's elite. A man trained in Paris, steeped in French tradition, and fluent in the language of grandeur. Hunt didn't just draw buildings, he designed power into architecture. He understood how to make a structure feel old, noble, inevitable, even if it had been invented yesterday. The second was Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect behind Central Park and countless other landmark projects. Olmsted didn't treat land as decoration. He treated it as a living system: soil, water, tree species, slope, erosion, and views all interacting like organs inside a body. When George hired Hunt and Olmsted, the project crossed a line. It stopped being a wealthy man's fantasy and became a coordinated campaign. A private railroad spur would have to reach the site. Kilns would have to fire brick by the millions. Workshops would have to be built to shape timber and dress stone. Roads would need to be carved through mountain terrain. Housing would need to appear for the labor force. This wouldn't be construction. It would be mobilization, a temporary industry created just to build one house. And this is where the dark story begins to sharpen. Because the public sees the glamour, the limestone, the towers, the winter garden glowing in the cold. But the real foundation of Biltmore wasn't just money. It was labor, logistics, people whose names never end up on postcards. And once you understand who George Vanderbilt was, a quiet man building a private world, you start to understand the tragedy hidden inside the dream. A private retreat this large can only exist if an entire invisible city exists behind it. So the next chapter isn't about beauty. It's about the build. About the moment the hilltop became a work zone. The estate became a supply chain, and thousands of hands began assembling a palace in the mountains, one stone at a time. Biltmore was never going to rise the way ordinary houses do. You couldn't simply hire a contractor, order materials, and wait. The scale of George Vanderbilt's vision demanded something closer to a military operation, planned, supplied, and executed with absolute control. When Richard Morris Hunt arrived in Asheville, he understood the problem immediately. The site was magnificent, but it was also isolated. Local suppliers couldn't provide the volume or quality required. There were no nearby workshops capable of producing carved stone, ornamental plaster, or complex metalwork at this level. Even transportation was a problem. Getting thousands of tons of material up a mountain was not a matter of convenience. It was a question of whether the project could function at all. Hunt's response was methodical and unsentimental. He designed Biltmore in the language of the French Renaissance, drawing inspiration from the great Chateaux of the Loire Valley. Not copies, but echoes. Steep slate roofs, asymmetrical massing, towers that anchored the corners, long horizontal lines balanced by vertical drama. Every proportion was calculated to feel historic without being theatrical. This wasn't pastiche, it was control. The materials were chosen with equal discipline. Indiana limestone for the exterior, dense, weather-resistant, and ideal for carving. Oak for floors, paneling, and structural joinery. Marble for fireplaces and accents. Copper for the roof, expensive but durable enough to last generations. Nothing was cheap. Nothing was accidental. Hunt designed for centuries, not decades. But design was only the beginning. To make the project possible, George authorized infrastructure before the house itself could rise. A private spur line from the Southern Railway was driven directly to the site. Without it, the project would fail. Limestone blocks traveled hundreds of miles by rail from Indiana. From the spur, They were hauled uphill by wagon teams to the plateau. Each block was numbered, tagged, and matched to Hunt's drawings. A mistake at this scale wasn't cosmetic, it could compromise the structure. On the estate, George built an industrial ecosystem from scratch. A brick kiln fired millions of bricks for interior walls and chimneys. A woodworking mill processed timber into flooring, beams, and paneling. A stone yard dressed limestone blocks and carved decorative elements. Blacksmiths forged hardware. Temporary housing sprang up for laborers. The mountain became a factory. At peak construction, more than 1,000 men worked on the project. They came from everywhere. Italian stonemasons brought old-world techniques, cutting stone to carry load, setting arches so gravity itself locked them in place. Local Appalachian carpenters worked hardwoods with practiced confidence, shaping interiors that would never be seen up close by most visitors. Brickmakers, plasterers, painters, glaziers, metalworkers, each trade layered onto the last. This wasn't romantic labor. The days were long, often 10 hours, 6 days a week. Winters were brutal. Stone dust burned lungs. Heights punished mistakes. Injuries were common. Some men slept in temporary quarters near the site. Others walked miles from Asheville before dawn and back again after dark. Payroll ledgers recorded names and wages, but they didn't record exhaustion. Skill mattered. Stonemasons earned more than general laborers. Carpenters and plasterers commanded higher day rates. Precision was demanded and rewarded. Hunt tolerated no carelessness. At this scale, sloppy work didn't just look bad, it aged badly. While Hunt orchestrated stone and structure, Frederick Law Olmsted fought a different battle. His first surveys of the land were discouraging. Decades of logging and poor farming had stripped hillsides bare. Thin mountain soils were eroding. Streams ran brown after storms. Native forests, once thick with chestnut oak and tulip poplar, were fragmented and weakened. The land around the future mansion looked tired, even wounded. Olmsted refused to treat the landscape as ornament. His plan was restorative. He believed scenery should be earned, not imposed. Reforestation came first. Hundreds of thousands of trees were planted, favoring native species suited to the soil and climate. Erosion was addressed through contour planting and terracing. The approach road, eventually nearly 3 miles long, was designed to reveal the house slowly, through controlled glimpses, building anticipation rather than shock. Near the mansion, formal gardens would impose order. Beyond them, a managed forest would stretch outward, a working landscape meant to demonstrate that beauty and productivity could coexist. This was not a park. It was a system. Hunt and Olmsted worked on different timelines. Hunt's house would take about 5 years. Olmsted's forest would take decades. Both understood they were building something meant to outlive them. Construction began in 1890. First came the foundations. Crews cut deep into the mountain soil. The basement would hold the estate's organs, boilers, coal bins, storage rooms, so excavation was extensive. Tons of earth were moved by hand and mule-drawn carts. Then the stone began to rise. Course by course, limestone walls climbed. Pre-carved pieces arrived ready to be set: arches, brackets, rosettes. Italian masons worked patiently, setting each block true. Mortar was mixed on site. Progress was steady but never rushed. Rain and cold slowed work. Precision ruled everything. As the exterior rose, engineers threaded the interior with systems. Biltmore would have electric light, still rare in the 1890s. Wiring was installed before plaster closed the walls. Safety standards were young, so the system was designed almost from scratch, including a separate generator building to reduce fire risk. Bedrooms received call buttons. Major rooms glowed at the flip of a switch. Heating posed another challenge. Central heat on this scale was almost unheard of. Massive boilers in the basement circulated hot water through miles of pipe to radiators in every room. The system demanded constant attention. Engineers would need to tend it year-round. Comfort had a permanent price. Woodwork followed. American white oak dominated, strong, resilient, and beautiful. The library alone took months, carved paneling from floor to ceiling, a hand-worked ceiling, and a hidden spiral stair leading to an upper gallery. The banquet hall's triple fireplace rose nearly to the rafters, combining stone and oak in a display of controlled excess. Bathrooms, dozens of them, received tile, porcelain fixtures, and hot and cold running water. In rural North Carolina, this bordered on science fiction. By 1894, the shell was closed. The copper roof went on seams carefully soldered, destined to weather into green blue over time. Inside, plasterers sealed walls, painters layered trim, electricians tested circuits, plumbers pressure tested lines. Furniture arrived, art was placed, books filled shelves. The deadline loomed. Christmas 1895. The house had to be ready, and it was. But, as the final fixtures were installed and the last scaffolding came down, one truth was already clear to those who understood the numbers. Building Biltmore had been an extraordinary achievement. Keeping it alive would be even harder. Because while the house was finished, the systems beneath it, the boilers, the staff, the forests, the farms, had only just begun their work, and the greatest experiment of all was still ahead. When the last guests drifted out after Christmas of 1895, the house finally fell quiet. Fires burned lower. Footsteps softened in the corridors. George Vanderbilt retreated to the place he loved most, the library. Surrounded by thousands of volumes, he could pretend, briefly, that Biltmore was complete. It wasn't, because the house, for all its scale and cost, was only half the vision. The other half stretched far beyond the terraces and formal gardens, across hills and valleys that told a harsher story. When George looked out from the windows, he didn't see untouched wilderness. He saw damage. The land had been abused long before he arrived. Loggers had stripped the best trees and left slash behind. Farmers had cleared steep slopes, planted corn and tobacco until the soil collapsed, then walked away. Rains cut gullies through exhausted fields. Streams ran thick with sediment after every storm. The native forest, once dense with American chestnut, oak, and tulip poplar, was fractured and weak. For most wealthy landowners, this would have been scenery to ignore. For George, it was the point. He didn't want a decorative estate. He wanted proof that land, even badly damaged land, could be restored through discipline and science, and that restoration could produce income without destroying the future. If Biltmore was to survive, it couldn't depend forever on inherited wealth. The land had to help pay its own way. That meant forestry. There was a problem. In America, forestry barely existed as a profession. Logging did. Timber speculation did. But long-term forest management, the kind practiced in Europe, was almost unknown. Forests were cut, not cultivated. George needed expertise that didn't yet exist in this country. So he imported the idea. At Frederick Law Olmsted's recommendation, George hired a young man, just back from European study, Gifford Pinchot. Pinchot was only 26 when he arrived at Biltmore in 1892, years before the house was finished. He was ambitious, analytical, and convinced that American forests were being destroyed through ignorance rather than necessity. When Pinchot surveyed the estate, he saw two things at once: a disaster and an opportunity. The disaster was obvious. Vast tracts were degraded. Tree species were out of balance. Fire risk was high. Erosion threatened watersheds. The opportunity was scale. With more than 125,000 acres, Biltmore offered room to experiment, to adapt European forestry methods to American conditions and prove they could work. Pinchot's first step was knowledge. Crews fanned out across the estate, inventorying what remained: species, ages, health, regeneration patterns, slopes, soils, watersheds. This wasn't guesswork, it was data collection, and it took months. Then came management. Instead of clear cutting, Pinchot introduced selective harvesting. Mature trees were marked and removed carefully, leaving younger growth to rise into the canopy. This kept forest cover intact, reduced erosion, and preserved long-term yield. Fire breaks were cut to slow wildfires. Controlled burns reduced dangerous undergrowth. In the worst areas, reforestation began, thousands of seedlings planted by hand, chosen for their suitability to the land and their future value. Local men were hired and trained to do the work. They learned to mark trees, plant seedlings, maintain roads, and think in decades instead of seasons. The forest became a classroom. Pinchot didn't stay long. In 1895, he left Biltmore to join the federal government. He would go on to become the first chief of the United States Forest Service, shaping national conservation policy. But before he left, he proved something critical: forestry could work in America. George replaced him with Karl A. Schenck, a German trained forester with rigorous discipline and a teacher's instinct. Schenck expanded the program, refining selective cutting, replanting, and fire management. And in 1898, he did something revolutionary. He founded the Biltmore Forest School. It was the first forestry school in the United States. Students lived on the estate and learned by doing. They marked timber, calculated volumes, built roads, managed burns, studied soils and disease. This wasn't theory, it was fieldwork. Over the next 15 years, hundreds of students passed through the program, carrying scientific forestry across the country into state agencies, private lands, and the federal system. Biltmore quietly became the birthplace of American forestry. This mattered more than most visitors ever realized. The house dazzled. The forest changed an industry. But forests grow slowly, and while the woodland healed, the bills arrived on schedule. Forestry generated income, but not quickly. Timber takes decades. Selective harvesting is steady, not spectacular. The forest could support the estate, but it could not rescue it alone. By the time Biltmore opened, George had created something extraordinary: a palace powered by modern technology, a landscape under scientific restoration, an estate that employed hundreds and functioned like a self-contained world. But every part of it depended on continuous funding. Coal had to be bought, staff had to be paid. Pipes, wires, roofs, and boilers needed constant care. Farms and forests helped, but they could not erase the core reality: Biltmore was expensive to exist. And as the forest slowly recovered, another truth crept closer, one that George would soon have to confront. The house could survive only as long as the fortune behind it remained untouched. And history was about to test that assumption. By the turn of the century, Biltmore had settled into rhythm. The fires were lit before dawn. The corridors filled quietly with motion. The house breathed, warmed, and functioned like a living organism, precisely as George Vanderbilt intended. But a living organism must be fed. Every day, more than 100 people moved through the estate to keep the illusion of effortlessness intact. Maids rose early to clean rooms that guests would never see dirty. Footmen carried coal, polished surfaces, and answered call buttons embedded discreetly into woodwork. Cooks prepared meals not just for the family, but for the staff as well. Laundresses battled mountains of linens, sheets, and clothing, heat and steam fogging their rooms year-round. Engineers tended boilers and generators, knowing a single failure could chill 4 acres of stone. Gardeners kept terraces precise. Stable hands managed horses and carriages. Foresters watched the woods. Biltmore did not rest, and it could not be paused. The house's systems were marvels for their time, but marvels are fragile. Central heating required massive boilers that consumed coal constantly. Electric lighting, still new enough to be risky, demanded vigilance. Plumbing stretched across thousands of feet of pipe. In winter, a frozen line could crack stone. In summer, humidity threatened plaster, wood, and books. Maintenance wasn't a task, it was a permanent state. George understood this better than anyone. He kept meticulous records. Ledgers listed every expense: fuel, wages, repairs, taxes, insurance. The numbers were clean, precise, and sobering. Operating costs ran into hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, millions in modern terms. This was not extravagance. This was survival. The estate was designed to offset some of the burden. Farms expanded steadily. The dairy became one of the largest in North Carolina, with Jersey cows producing milk, butter, and cheese under modern sanitary conditions. Orchards yielded apples and peaches. Vegetable gardens and greenhouses supplied kitchens year-round. Hogs and poultry filled smokehouses and pantries. These efforts reduced dependence on outside markets and stabilized costs. The forest began producing modest, but reliable income through selective harvesting. Timber sales weren't dramatic, but they were sustainable. More importantly, the land was healing. Erosion slowed. Wildlife returned. Young forests thickened where wasteland had been. Biltmore Village emerged as another pillar of the system. Designed to house workers and provide essential services, it included cottages, a church, a school, and shops. Wages were fair by contemporary standards. Housing was clean and well-maintained. Education and medical care were available. The approach was paternalistic, but in an era of mill towns and mining camps, it was comparatively humane. George believed stability bred loyalty, and loyalty kept the machine running. Social life at Biltmore reflected this same discipline. George was never interested in spectacle. After his marriage to Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in 1898, the estate remained calm and controlled. Small dinners, thoughtful guests, occasional concerts. Nothing resembling the costume balls and excess of Newport society. Every large gathering multiplied costs, extra staff, extra fuel, extra supplies. George avoided them deliberately. This restraint wasn't miserliness. It was arithmetic. Biltmore functioned because income still flowed in from the Vanderbilt fortune. Investments in railroads, real estate, and finance generated the surplus needed to cover what farms and forests could not. As long as that income remained steady, the system held. But it was a narrow balance. There was little room for shock, no buffer large enough to absorb a major downturn without pain. The estate could not simply scale down without losing function. Close rooms and moisture creeps in. Cut staff too deeply and systems fail. Defer maintenance too long and repairs become disasters. George knew this. He managed carefully, constantly searching for efficiencies. He expanded productive capacity where possible. He resisted unnecessary expense. He believed time was his ally, that as forests matured and operations refined, the estate would carry more of itself. For a while it worked. By 1910, Biltmore looked stable. The house had been running for 15 years. Systems were reliable. Farms and forestry contributed meaningfully. Biltmore Village thrived. George and Edith had a daughter, Cornelia, born in 1900. The estate felt established, almost permanent. Then the world changed the rules. In 1913, the United States ratified the 16th Amendment, introducing a federal income tax. Until then, fortunes like the Vanderbilts had operated in a world where income largely escaped federal reach. Property taxes existed, but income itself flowed freely. That ended. The new tax immediately claimed a significant share of George's annual income, the very income that sustained Biltmore's operations. Rates for the wealthy rose quickly. Each year, more money went to Washington, and less remained to feed boilers, pay staff, and fund repairs. The math broke. Expenses did not fall just because taxes rose. The house still needed coal, staff still needed wages, maintenance still demanded attention. George made cuts where he could, travel reduced, purchases postponed, vacancies left unfilled. But there were limits. Cut too deeply, and the estate would unravel. He believed he could adapt, but history didn't give him time. In March of 1914, George traveled to Washington, D.C., seeking treatment for worsening health problems related to appendicitis. Complications escalated. Emergency surgery followed. On March 6, 1914, George Washington Vanderbilt Tully died at the age of 51. The telegram reached Biltmore quietly. The machine kept running, but the mind that designed it was gone. And suddenly, the future of the largest private house in America rested on someone who had not built it, but would have to decide whether it could survive. When George Vanderbilt died in March of 1914, Biltmore did not pause to mourn. Fires still had to be lit. Boilers still needed coal. Staff still reported for work before dawn. The house continued to function exactly as it had the day before. That was the problem. George had been more than the owner. He was the stabilizing force, the one who understood every system, every expense, every fragile balance holding the estate together. His death didn't just leave grief behind. It left an operation without its architect. Edith Vanderbilt inherited everything: the house, the land, the farms, the forests, the payroll, the debt, and the responsibility for hundreds of families whose livelihoods depended on decisions she would now have to make. She was 43 years old. Her daughter Cornelia was still a teenager, and the estate she inherited was magnificent and financially strained. George's will left Biltmore to Edith for her lifetime, then to Cornelia. On paper, the assets were vast. But assets don't pay bills, cash flow does. Edith understood this immediately. She sat at George's desk in the library, opened the ledgers he had kept so carefully, and read the numbers without illusion. The picture was brutal. Annual operating costs hovered around $250,000 a year, a staggering sum at the time, equivalent to many millions today. Farms, dairy operations, and forestry together covered only a fraction of that. The rest had always come from George's investment income. But now that income was smaller. Federal income taxes, newly imposed just a year earlier, were draining a large share of what George once relied on. Settling his estate added more pressure. Without change, the numbers pointed in one direction only. Biltmore was losing money. Not dramatically, not recklessly, but steadily, month after month, year after year. If nothing changed, capital would be consumed. And once capital ran out, the end would be swift: forced sales, creditors, auctions, fragmentation of the estate, and almost certainly the loss of the house itself. Advisors told Edith what many widows in her position were told: sell. Sell the land. Sell the house. Keep a comfortable portion. Walk away. She refused, not out of sentimentality alone. Edith understood something deeper. Biltmore was not just a residence. It was the largest employer in the region. It sustained farms, forestry work, village businesses, and entire families. If it collapsed, the damage would ripple far beyond the gates. But refusing to sell everything didn't mean refusing to sell anything. Edith approached the problem the way George would have appreciated, by separating what was essential from what was negotiable. The house and its immediate grounds were irreplaceable. That was the heart of the vision. The forests, however meaningful, were also an asset, one that could be converted into security without destroying the core. So Edith made a decision that would reshape American conservation history. In 1915, she opened negotiations with the federal government. The United States Forest Service was still young, and it was looking for large, contiguous tracts of land suitable for national forests. The irony was sharp. George's own forestry experiment, guided first by Gifford Pinchot, had helped inspire the very agency now knocking at Edith's door. The land the government wanted was the land George had assembled and restored. Surveyors arrived. Boundaries were walked. Appraisals were argued. Lawyers worked through details. Politics slowed everything. But in 1916, the deal was done. Approximately 86,700 acres, nearly 2/3 of the original estate, were sold to the federal government. The land became Pisgah National Forest. The price was fair, though less than George had invested in buying and improving it. But the sale achieved Edith's goal. It generated enough capital to retire debts, create a financial buffer, and keep the house alive. It also ensured that George's forestry legacy would not vanish. The forest school closed. Karl Schenk returned to Germany, but the land itself would remain protected and managed under the principles George had championed. Edith retained about 8,000 acres around the house and village, still immense, but manageable. Then came the cuts. Staff numbers dropped from over 100 to around 60. Edith handled reductions carefully, attrition where possible, targeted layoffs where necessary. Departments were consolidated. Vacant positions were left unfilled. Formal gardens were simplified. Entire wings of the house were closed and unheated to save coal. Cosmetic work was postponed indefinitely. Edith cut her own life down to essentials. Entertaining nearly vanished. Travel was rare. Spending was monitored line by line. Every dollar had to justify its existence. This was not decline. It was triage. Through discipline, Biltmore survived the 1910s and stabilized into the 1920s. It was no longer the expansive vision George had imagined, but it was alive. The house stood, staff were paid. The village endured. Cornelia grew up in a home that was quieter, leaner, and far more fragile than it appeared. Then, just as stability returned, the world collapsed again. In 1929, the stock market crashed, and Biltmore, once more, found itself standing on the edge. When the stock market collapsed in October of 1929, the shock didn't arrive at Biltmore all at once. It crept in quietly, through numbers on paper. Dividends shrank, then disappeared. Investments that had carried the estate through lean years lost value almost overnight. Edith saw it before many others did. She had lived through one financial reckoning already. She knew what a slow bleed looked like, and this was worse. By 1930, the Great Depression had wrapped itself around western North Carolina. Tourism evaporated. Hotels in Asheville stood half empty. Restaurants closed. Shops went dark. Unemployment surged. Families that once relied on steady wages now scrambled for survival. Biltmore felt the pressure immediately. Income fell. Expenses, though already pared down, did not. The boilers still demanded coal. The roof still leaked when storms came. Stone still weathered. Staff, fewer than before but still essential, needed wages. The house could not be paused without inviting irreversible damage. Edith faced a brutal reality. She could cut further, dismiss more workers, close more rooms, defer maintenance again, but there was a limit. Push past it, and the house itself would begin to fail. Once stone structures start to decay, recovery becomes exponentially more expensive. A few neglected years could doom the entire place. Selling was discussed again. Breaking up land parcels. Offering the house itself. But in the depths of the Depression, who would buy a 4-acre stone palace that cost a fortune just to heat? Even if a buyer existed, the likely outcome was grim, stripping of art, abandonment, slow ruin. Then someone proposed something unthinkable. Open Biltmore to the public. For Edith's world, this bordered on scandal. Privacy wasn't a preference, it was a principle. The idea of strangers walking through personal rooms, examining furniture, peering into spaces once meant for family life felt like a violation. But Edith had already crossed lines others wouldn't. She had sold most of George's land. She had dismantled the estate's scale. She had accepted that survival required adaptation. And the idea had another advantage. Opening Biltmore wouldn't just help the house, it could help Asheville. Visitors would need lodging, food, gasoline, shops, guides. In a region drowning in unemployment, even modest tourism could mean jobs. Edith made the decision. In March of 1930, Biltmore would open its doors to paying visitors. Preparation was careful and restrained. The house wasn't turned into spectacle. Rooms were arranged for viewing, not entertainment. Ropes and barriers protected furnishings. Visitor routes were planned to minimize wear. Private family areas were sealed off. Staff were trained to manage flow, answer questions, and keep order. Admission was set at $1 per person, expensive by Depression standards, but not unreachable. Opening day carried real uncertainty. Would anyone come? Would people pay to see a mansion while breadlines grew? Would visitors resent the display, or find hope in it? They came. Locals, regional travelers, curious families, former workers. People who had heard of the house but never imagined seeing inside. Some arrived by car. Others walked. A few came simply because there was nowhere else to go. They stepped into the entrance hall and looked up. They stood beneath the soaring banquet hall ceiling. They moved quietly through the library, past shelves of books they had never imagined existed in one place. They lingered in the winter garden, warmth and greenery under glass while the world outside struggled. For some, it was awe. For others, bitterness. For many, something else entirely, a reminder that skill, craft, and beauty had once been possible, and might be again. The income wasn't huge, but it mattered. More importantly, the model worked. Biltmore was no longer just a private home struggling to survive. It had become a museum. Through the early 1930s, the estate existed in this new identity. Visitor numbers rose and fell with the economy. Some seasons were thin, others better. Edith balanced maintenance against ticket sales, always aware that one bad year could undo everything. Then, just as the country began to breathe again, history delivered another shock. December 1941. Pearl Harbor. America went to war. Tourism stopped almost overnight. Gasoline was rationed. Rubber was scarce. Leisure travel became impossible. Visitors vanished, and with them, Biltmore's lifeline. Once again, Edith faced the edge. But this time, an unexpected request arrived. One that would give the house a purpose no one could have predicted. And turn a palace into a vault. After Pearl Harbor, silence returned to Biltmore in a way it never had before. Not the quiet of wealth, not the calm of routine, but the stillness of a nation holding its breath. Gasoline rationing erased tourism almost overnight. Cars vanished from the approach road. Hotels in Asheville emptied again. The modest stream of visitors that had carried Biltmore through the Depression dried up completely. Ticket booths closed. Guides were dismissed. Rooms went dark. For Edith, the math turned lethal. The estate still had fixed costs, heat, security, maintenance, but almost no income. She had already cut everything that could be cut without destroying the house. There were no more easy decisions left. Then the request came. Quiet, formal, unexpected. The National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. had a problem, a serious one. As the United States entered World War II, officials feared that priceless works of art, paintings, sculptures, historical documents, could be damaged or destroyed. Washington was not a battlefield, but it was a symbolic target. Sabotage, bombing, or disaster could wipe out irreplaceable cultural heritage in a single night. They needed a safe place. Not just any storage facility. A location that met exacting conditions far inland, away from ports and major targets, built of stone, largely fireproof, capable of stable temperature and humidity, large enough to hold hundreds of crated masterpieces, secure, isolated, and controllable. Biltmore fit every requirement. It sat deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Its walls were thick limestone. Its rooms were vast. Its climate system, installed decades earlier for comfort, could regulate temperature with remarkable consistency. The estate was private, gated, and reachable by only a few controlled roads. In other words, a fortress disguised as a house. Negotiations were discreet. No public announcements. No press. In 1942, trucks began arriving at night unmarked, guarded. Wooden crates were unloaded through service entrances and carried into selected rooms, spaces chosen for minimal windows, stable conditions, and sheer size. Inside those crates were some of the most valuable objects in American culture. Paintings attributed to Rembrandt, Raphael, Vermeer. Works by Gilbert Stuart, including the famous portrait of George Washington that appears on the $1 bill. Sculptures, rare documents, and artifacts whose loss would have been permanent. Most of the staff never knew exactly what was stored. They were told only that it was important, fragile, and not to be discussed. Armed guards, dressed in civilian clothing to avoid attention, patrolled the grounds day and night. Federal officials monitored humidity and temperature regularly. Records were kept. Nothing was left to chance. Biltmore became a vault. The irony was sharp. A house built as a private retreat for books and reflection now protected the nation's artistic soul, while the world burned. The winter garden still whispered with watered. The library lights still glowed, but instead of guests and music, the halls held silence and crates. For Edith, the arrangement was a lifeline. The government paid rent, not lavish, but steady. Federal security reduced the estate's own costs, and the presence of guards ensured protection during a time of widespread uncertainty. Most importantly, Biltmore once again had purpose. This wasn't tourism. This wasn't spectacle. This was service. The arrangement continued through 1942, 1943, and into 1944. As battles raged overseas, masterpieces sat quietly in mountain rooms, protected by stone, distance, and discipline. When representatives from the National Gallery visited, they found conditions stable. The house performed exactly as it had been built to perform. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945 and the Pacific War closed in August, the trucks returned. Crates were reopened, inspected, and loaded. Nothing had been lost, nothing damaged. America's art returned to Washington intact. Biltmore had done its job, and in doing so, it revealed something crucial to Edith. The house did not survive because it was beautiful. It survived because it could serve. It had been a private home, then a public museum, then a national vault. Each transformation had felt unthinkable, until it became necessary. As peace returned, tourism slowly resumed. Cars came back. Visitors followed. But Edith was aging now, and the future could not be left to improvisation. The question was no longer how to survive the next crisis. It was how to make sure Biltmore would never face extinction again, and that question would fall to the next generation. When the war ended, Biltmore reopened to a world that had changed permanently. America emerged from World War II wealthier, more mobile, and more restless than ever before. Automobiles replaced railways as the dominant form of travel. Highways crept across the landscape. Middle-class families began taking vacations not to prove status, but to experience history, scenery, and escape. Tourism was no longer a novelty, it was an industry. Edith Vanderbilt understood this shift, but she also understood her own limits. She had saved Biltmore through discipline, sacrifice, and adaptability. She had sold land, cut staff, opened the house to strangers, and even turned it into a wartime vault. But by the late 1940s and early 1950s, she was in her 70s. The future of the estate could no longer rest on personal endurance. The responsibility was passing to the next generation. Her daughter, Cornelia, had lived a complicated life shaped by the weight of inheritance. She loved Biltmore, but she had never been raised to run it as an enterprise. Her sons, George and William Cecil, stood at a crossroads. They inherited not just a house, but a question: what is Biltmore supposed to be now? It was too large to function as a private home, too expensive to survive on sentiment, too important to abandon. By the 1950s, the answer began to clarify. Biltmore could no longer be treated as a family residence that happened to accept visitors. It had to become a professional institution, managed, planned, and operated with the same seriousness as a museum or a historic site. In 1963, Biltmore was designated a National Historic Landmark. The title carried prestige, but also pressure. This was no longer just family property. It was officially recognized as part of the nation's cultural heritage. Letting it decay was no longer a private failure. It would be a public one. William Cecil Vanderbilt took primary responsibility for guiding the estate forward. His approach was pragmatic and modern. If Biltmore was going to survive, it needed diversified income, professional management, and a long-term preservation strategy. Tourism expanded deliberately. Visitor facilities improved. Parking was organized. Marketing became intentional rather than passive. Seasonal programming drew guests year-round instead of only during peak months. Events were introduced, carefully chosen to fit the character of the estate. Weddings, conferences, holiday celebrations. Each one balanced revenue against wear and tear. The philosophy was simple but strict: every visitor must help pay for preservation, not accelerate destruction. Preservation itself became systematic. The copper roof, now more than a century old, required constant attention. Limestone facades were cleaned and conserved to prevent loss of carved detail. Interior oak paneling needed refinishing. Plaster demanded continuous repair. Electrical and plumbing systems, originally installed in the 1890s, had to be modernized discreetly, hidden behind walls so the historic character remained untouched. This work was slow and expensive. Specialized craftspeople were needed: stone carvers, plasterers, metalworkers, conservators trained to match original materials and techniques. Every project began with research. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was improvised. Preservation was no longer a reaction to damage, it was an ongoing discipline. The estate also looked for new, compatible revenue streams. Agriculture remained part of the identity. Gardens produced food sold directly to guests. Forestry continued on sustainable principles. And in 1985, the estate launched a bold experiment, a winery. It was a turning point. Wine gave visitors a reason to linger, to return, and to associate Biltmore not just with history, but with experience. It generated steady income without compromising the house itself. Over time, the winery became one of the most successful in the country, proving that heritage and commerce did not have to be enemies. By the late 20th century, Biltmore had completed a transformation that few private estates ever achieve. It was no longer a fragile relic. It was a functioning enterprise, a museum, a workplace, a cultural anchor. The estate now employed thousands. Its economic impact rippled across Asheville and western North Carolina. Hotels, restaurants, shops, and tour companies thrived because Biltmore existed. What had once strained a fortune now sustained a region. But one final question remained. Had Biltmore escaped its dark story, or simply rewritten it? That answer lies not in the numbers, but in the cost that can't be measured on ledgers. And that is where the story ends. Today, Biltmore feels inevitable. It rises from the Blue Ridge Mountains as if it has always been there, solid, confident, permanent. More than 1 million visitors pass through its doors each year. Weddings are staged beneath its towers. Wine is poured from bottles bearing its name. The house glows during the holidays, dressed in light and tradition. It looks like success. But inevitability is an illusion. Biltmore survived because it changed, again and again, at moments when change felt like betrayal. Every generation that touched it had to choose between purity and survival always won. George Vanderbilt built Biltmore as a private refuge, a place of quiet, order, books, and forests restored by reason. He paid for it with inherited wealth, modern technology, and thousands of hours of unseen labor. But he never solved the final equation. The house was larger than its income. Beauty outpaced sustainability. Edith Vanderbilt saved it by dismantling the dream. She sold the mountains. She shrank the household. She opened private rooms to strangers. She turned a palace into a museum, then into a vault. She accepted that dignity sometimes means letting go. Without her discipline, Biltmore would have vanished within a decade of George's death. The next generation completed the transformation. They stripped away the last illusion that Biltmore was a home. They made it an institution, professionally managed, publicly shared, commercially supported. They accepted that preservation is not nostalgia. It is work. Endless, expensive, unglamorous work. So who actually paid for Biltmore? The workers who cut stone and planted trees. The staff who kept fires lit and halls clean. George, who poured a fortune into a vision too large for one lifetime. Edith, who paid with sacrifice and restraint. And the visitors, millions of them, whose tickets, meals, and purchases now keep the walls standing. And how much does the dream cost today? Not just money. It costs privacy. It costs reinvention. It costs the humility to let something private become public. It costs the courage to admit that beauty alone cannot survive without service. Biltmore endures not because it was perfect, but because it adapted. It learned to serve, first a man, then a family, then a nation, and now the public. That is the real secret hidden behind the limestone walls. Every great house carries shadows. Every grand vision demands payment. Biltmore paid its price in full, over generations. And that is why it still stands. If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built it, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support makes these stories possible. Tell me in the comments which house we should explore next: the Breakers in Newport, Hearst Castle in California, Lyndhurst on the Hudson, or a forgotten mansion with a story still buried. These places are not just buildings. They are decisions made under pressure, dreams tested by reality. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next investigation.